I woke up in the early hours of the morning and saw my own son replacing my oxygen mask with an empty one. I heard his exact words, "This way I'll inherit everything faster." I never imagined my own flesh and blood would try to kill me for a house. Before I continue, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, because we have new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments from which city you are watching us. My name is Victor Alton Reed. I am 66 years old, and I never thought I would end up telling a story like this. Throughout my life, I built a modest but respectable estate in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the city. I worked as a civil engineer for 42 years. I built a house that today is worth approximately $350,000, and I always believed that all that effort would have a purpose, to leave something valuable to my son, Mark. Mark Alton Davis is 34 years old. He is my only son, the result of my marriage to Sophia Davis Carter, which ended 11 years ago. He was always an intelligent boy, but over the years, I noticed something that worried me: his obsession with money. It wasn't a healthy ambition. It was something different. Every time we met, the conversation inevitably drifted toward my properties, my savings, my future plans. On August 20, 2024, everything changed. That afternoon, I began to feel a terrible tightness in my chest. I had been living alone since the divorce, so I called Mark. He arrived quickly, I must admit. He took me to the Metropolitan Medical Center with apparent concern. The doctors diagnosed acute respiratory failure and admitted me immediately to the intermediate care unit. They connected me to a high-flow oxygen system and told me I needed to remain under observation for at least 4 days. During the first few hours, Mark stayed with me. He seemed restless, nervous. I attributed his behavior to a son's natural worry for his sick father. I was completely wrong. Now, recalling those moments with clarity, I recognize signals I ignored. The way he observed the medical equipment, his insistent questions about my actual condition, whether it was serious, how long I could live with this condition. That night, around 11 p.m., I told him to go rest. He insisted on staying. He said he wanted to make sure I was okay. I accepted, moved by what I interpreted as filial love. I fell asleep, feeling that despite our differences, my son loved me. I woke up near 3 a.m. I don't know exactly what pulled me from sleep. Perhaps some primitive survival instinct. The room was dim, barely illuminated by the medical monitors. I carefully opened my eyes and saw Mark standing by my bed. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the oxygen mask connected to my face. My heart began to pound, but I forced myself to remain still. Something in his posture alerted me. It wasn't the posture of someone worried. It was the posture of someone calculating, evaluating, deciding. I closed my eyes almost completely, leaving just a slit to observe. I saw his hands slowly approach the oxygen tube. At that moment, I heard a noise in the hallway, and Mark quickly retreated, sitting in the chair as if he had never moved. A nurse entered briefly, checked my vital signs on the monitor, and left. Mark waited about 5 more minutes. I continued to pretend to sleep, but my mind was racing. What had I just witnessed? Was my son really considering doing something with my oxygen? I tried to convince myself that I was paranoid, that the medication was making me imagine things, but something deep inside me knew the truth. During the next few minutes, I kept my eyes almost closed and my breathing shallow. Mark got up again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He walked directly to the mask. What I saw next chilled my blood. Mark carefully disconnected the main oxygen tube from my face mask. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost professional. For what seemed like endless seconds, I watched him hold the tube in his right hand, while with his left, he searched for something in his jacket pocket. He pulled out another tube, identical in appearance to the original, but clearly empty, with no real connection to any oxygen source. My first instinct was to scream, to move, to defend myself, but something stopped me. Perhaps it was the shock of understanding what was happening. Perhaps it was a lifetime of training to analyze situations before acting. I remained absolutely motionless, controlling my breathing to make it seem natural, though my heart pounded in my chest with brutal force. As he performed the exchange, Mark spoke. He whispered, but in the silence of that hospital room, I heard every word with absolute clarity. This way you won't take long to die. I need your house now. I've waited too long for this. His voice held no emotion. It was cold, calculating, as if he was solving a logistical problem and not planning the murder of his own father. I remained motionless as he connected the fake tube to my mask. My lungs already began to feel the difference. The air coming in was insufficient, barely ambient air filtered by the mask. Without the concentrated oxygen flow my condition required, I felt my breathing become more labored, as each inhalation demanded more effort. Mark stepped back to observe his work. He stood by the bed for what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes. I struggled to maintain the appearance of deep sleep while my body silently panicked. The lack of adequate oxygen began to affect my lucidity. Bright spots appeared behind my closed eyelids. Then I heard something else. Mark pulled out his mobile phone. The screen's glow briefly illuminated his face, and I could see his expression through my half-closed lashes. He was smiling. My son was smiling as he left me to die. He began to type something, probably a message. I couldn't read what it said, but the naturalness of his movements made it clear he had planned this in advance. The following minutes were the longest of my life. My brain was starting to feel fuzzy, dull. Thoughts became slow, difficult to form. I knew I needed to do something, but it became harder and harder to focus on what exactly. Mark was still sitting there now, waiting patiently, waiting for his father to stop breathing. I tried to calculate how long I had been without enough oxygen. 5 minutes, perhaps 6. The doctors had explained that my lung condition was delicate. Without adequate support, my oxygen saturation would drop quickly. I already felt dizzy, confused. My body was begging for air, but I couldn't give myself away. If Mark discovered I was awake, I didn't know what he would do. Just as I felt I would lose consciousness, the room door opened. A nurse entered quickly. It wasn't the same one who had come before. This one was younger. She had her hair pulled back in a high ponytail. I saw her identification badge even in my altered state. Angela Vance Parker. Angela went directly to the vital signs monitor. She frowned immediately. "Saturation levels are dropping," she said aloud, more to herself than to Mark. She approached me, and that's when she noticed it. Her eyes fixed on the oxygen tube, followed it to the mask, and then she touched it, checking the connection. "This tube is not connected correctly," she stated, and her tone changed completely. It was no longer routine. It was alarmed. She looked directly at Mark. "Did you touch this?" Mark stammered something about being worried, about checking that everything was fine. But Angela had already seen something else. On the floor, partially hidden under the chair where Mark had been sitting, was the original oxygen tube. She picked it up, examined it, and the expression on her face changed to something I can only describe as professionally controlled horror. Angela held the original tube in her hand and then stared at Mark. This is the real oxygen tube. The one connected to the patient has no flow. Her voice was firm, accusatory. Mark tried to respond, but she had already pressed the emergency button on the wall. A discreet alarm sounded in the hallway, alerting the on-call medical staff. "I need you to leave this room immediately," Angela ordered, as she removed the fake tube and reconnected the original oxygen system to my mask. The flow of oxygen-rich air returned to my lungs like water to someone dying of thirst. The sensation was almost painful due to the contrast, but my body received it desperately. Mark stood up abruptly. "I was just checking that my father was properly connected. I am his son. I have a right to be concerned." His words sounded rehearsed, too perfect to be spontaneous. Angela didn't respond to him. She had already picked up her radio and spoke in a low but urgent voice. "I need security in room 312. Possible medical equipment tampering. I also need the on-call doctor immediately." At that moment, I decided I had to stop pretending. I opened my eyes completely and looked directly at my son. Our eyes met, and what I saw was shattering. There was no remorse in his eyes. There was rage. Rage because he had been discovered, because his plan had failed. He looked at me as if I were an annoying obstacle, not as his father. "Dad," he said, his voice attempting to sound relieved. "Thank goodness you're awake. This nurse is misunderstanding everything. I couldn't bear to hear any more lies." "I heard you, Mark," I said in a weak but clear voice. "I heard every word you said, that you needed my house, that this way you would inherit faster." The color drained from his face. For a second, just 1 second, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Then, the mask of indignation returned. "You're confused by the medication. You don't know what you're saying." But it was already too late. 2 security guards entered the room, followed by Dr. David Miller Reynolds, the doctor who had been supervising my treatment since admission. Dr. Reynolds immediately approached my bed, quickly checking the vital signs monitor. "Mr. Reed, how are you feeling?" I struggled to speak. My brain was still processing slowly due to the lack of oxygenation. He took away my oxygen," I managed to say, pointing at Mark with a weak gesture. "My son tried to kill me." Angela intervened professionally, showing both tubes to the doctor. "I found the patient connected to this tube with no oxygen flow. The real tube was on the floor. The family member was alone with the patient when I entered." Dr. Reynolds examined both tubes, and his expression turned grave. He looked at Mark with a mixture of disbelief and professional repulsion. "The cameras," Angela said suddenly, turning to the guards. "This room has surveillance cameras by ICU protocol. Everything was recorded." One of the guards nodded and spoke into his radio, requesting immediate access to the security footage. Mark paled even more. He clearly hadn't considered the cameras. "This is ridiculous," he protested in an increasingly less convincing voice. "I'm his son. Why would I do something like that?" Dr. Reynolds did not respond to Mark. Instead, he addressed the guards. "No one enters or leaves this room until we review the recordings. And I need you to call the police. If what is alleged is true, we are looking at attempted homicide. The word homicide echoed in the room like thunder. Mark tried to walk toward the door, but the guards blocked his exit. "I have the right to leave. You can't detain me here," he demanded with a trembling voice. One of the guards, a burly man in his 40s named Robert Bob Palmer, according to his identification, responded calmly. "You can wait here or in the security office. You choose." I watched everything from my bed, still weak, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. My own son had tried to murder me. Not in a fit of rage, not in an accident. He had planned it. He had brought a fake tube. He had waited patiently for me to die. The implications of this were too enormous to fully comprehend. At that moment, Dr. Reynolds remained by my bed as he performed a basic neurological examination. He asked me to follow his finger with my eyes, to squeeze his hands, to answer simple questions. My responses were slow, confused. I felt as if my brain were functioning through a thick fog. "Mr. Reed, do you know what day it is today?" I had to think too long before answering. Saturday. The doctor noted something in my file with a worried expression. "There are signs of cerebral hypoxia," he announced, addressing Angela. "Confusion, delayed response time, possible temporary cognitive impairment. We need an urgent MRI to rule out permanent damage." His words hit me hard. Permanent brain damage because of my own son. I looked at Mark, who was still standing between the two guards, and I saw something new in his expression. Real panic began to replace his previous feigned indignation. Minutes later, 2 police officers arrived in the room. A woman approximately 40 years old, named Detective Claire Nelson Scott, and her partner, Officer Michael Olson Clark. Detective Scott introduced herself with efficient professionalism and immediately began taking statements. She first spoke with Angela, who recounted exactly what she had found upon entering the room. "The patient had an oxygen saturation of 82% when I entered," Angela explained, consulting her notes. "The normal level for someone with his condition under supplementation should be above 95%. I found a tube disconnected from the main oxygen system and the original tube lying on the floor next to the family member's chair." The detective meticulously noted every detail. Then she turned to me. I tried to relate what had happened, but my words came out jumbled, fragmented. I described waking up, seeing Mark manipulating the equipment, hearing his words about the inheritance, but my speech lacked clear temporal coherence. Dr. Reynolds intervened. "The patient presents cognitive alteration consistent with oxygen deprivation. His statements may not be completely reliable at this time due to neurological impairment." Mark immediately seized the opportunity. "You see? He's confused. The medication, the stress of hospitalization, all of this has disoriented him. I would never harm my own father. This is a terrible misunderstanding." His performance was convincing to anyone who hadn't heard his murderous words in the dark. But Detective Scott didn't seem impressed. "The security cameras," she said simply. One of the guards confirmed that the hospital's head of security was already preparing the recordings. Minutes later, a laptop was brought into the room. The head of security, an older man named Frank Stevens, set up the video and began playback. We all gathered around the screen, except for me, who remained in bed connected to oxygen. From my position, I could see the expressions of those present as they watched the recording. The video clearly showed Mark getting up from the chair, approaching my bed, disconnecting the real oxygen tube, and replacing it with another one he took from his jacket. But the most damning part came when Frank activated the audio. The quality wasn't perfect, but Mark's words were heard with enough clarity. "This way, you won't take long to die. I need your house now." The silence in the room after those words was absolute. Even the medical monitors seemed to stop emitting sounds for a moment. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His face had lost all color. Detective Scott turned to him with a stony expression. "Mark Alton Davis, you are under arrest for aggravated attempted homicide. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Officer Clark already had the handcuffs ready. "No, wait," Mark stammered finally. "I can explain. I was joking. It was just a bad joke. I would never have—" No one believed him. Not even he seemed to believe his own words. The officers handcuffed him while formally reading him his rights. Mark looked at me one last time before being led out of the room. In that look, there was no filial love, no remorse, only resentment and hatred. When the door closed behind him, something inside me definitively broke. The next few hours passed in a medical and legal haze. I was transferred to the MRI unit around 5 a.m. The procedure lasted almost 40 minutes, during which I remained motionless inside that noisy machine, trying to process the reality that my only son had just been arrested for attempting to murder me. My mind wandered between memories of young Mark running in the park, laughing on his birthdays, and the recent image of his hands coldly disconnecting my life source. When I returned to the room, Dr. Reynolds already had the preliminary results. He sat by my bed with a serious expression. "Victor, the MRI shows areas of hypoperfusion in regions of your frontal and temporal lobes. In simple terms, there were areas of your brain that did not receive enough oxygen during the time you were disconnected. This explains the confusion, the short-term memory problems, and the difficulty articulating complex thoughts. Is it permanent?" I managed to ask, though I had to repeat the question because the first time the words came out jumbled. The doctor sighed. "It's too early to determine with certainty. The brain has capacity for recovery, especially if the damage is detected quickly, as in your case, but I cannot promise complete recovery. Some sequelae may persist, problems with fine motor coordination, memory lapses, occasional difficulty finding specific words." I nodded slowly, processing this new reality. My son had not only tried to kill me, but he had left permanent marks on my brain, invisible scars I would carry the rest of my life as a reminder of his betrayal. The doctor continued, "We will maintain strict observation for at least a week. You will need subsequent cognitive rehabilitation and long-term neurological follow-up." Around 8 a.m., my mobile phone began to ring insistently. It was Sophia, my ex-wife. Angela, who had stayed with me despite her shift ending, answered the call when she saw me struggling to coordinate my movements to reach the device. "Ma'am, this is Nurse Angela Vance Parker from Metropolitan Medical Center. Your ex-husband is stable, but he cannot speak extensively at this moment." I heard Sophia's shrill voice on the other end, frantically asking about Mark. Angela looked at me questioningly, and I nodded, indicating she could tell her. "Your son was arrested this morning for attempting to disconnect Mr. Reed's oxygen system. Everything was recorded on video, with audio. He is in police custody." A silence followed, then incomprehensible shouts. Sophia hung up abruptly. An hour later, Sophia burst into my room like a hurricane. At 58, she was still an imposing woman, tall, with a dominant presence. "Victor, this is crazy. Mark told me it's all a misunderstanding. You were sedated, confused. He would never do such a thing." Her denial was so profound, it was almost comical if it weren't tragic. "There are recordings, Sophia," I said with effort. Each word required conscious concentration. "Video and audio. He said he needed my house, that this way he would inherit faster. I heard it clearly." Sophia shook her head violently. "The recording must be manipulated or misinterpreted. Our son is not a murderer. He was probably just nervously joking from the stress of seeing you sick." Angela, still present, intervened firmly. "Ma'am, I witnessed the moment. Your son had replaced the oxygen tube with an empty one. Mr. Reed presented dangerously low saturation levels. Without my intervention, he would have lost consciousness in minutes and possibly died within 15 or 20 minutes. There is no alternative interpretation possible." Sophia completely ignored her, addressing only me. "Victor, you have to drop the charges. He's your son. Think of what this will do to his life, his future. A conviction for something like this would completely destroy him." I stared at her, seeing for the first time, with absolute clarity, something that had been there for years. Sophia had always protected Mark from the consequences of his actions. From childhood until now, every mistake, every fault, had always found justification or excuse. "I will not drop anything," I replied, with all the firmness I could muster. "Mark tried to kill me for money, for a house. There is irrefutable evidence. He will face the consequences of his actions for the first time in his life." Sophia looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You are his father. How can you do this to him?" The question was so absurd, I almost laughed. "I am his father," I repeated slowly. "He is the one who tried to do this to me." Sophia left the room, slamming the door, which echoed down the hallway. Angela approached and gently adjusted my pillow. "I'm so sorry for all of this, Mr. Reed." Her genuine empathy contrasted brutally with Sophia's blind defense of our son. I realized in that instant that a nurse, unknown until that morning, had shown me more real care and concern than my own family. At noon, an unexpected but hugely welcome visit arrived. William Bill Pearson, my best friend for 32 years, entered the room carrying a bag with clean clothes and personal items he had collected from my house using the emergency key I had given him years ago. Bill is 64 years old, a retired attorney, and one of the few people in the world I trust absolutely. "Victor, my God," he exclaimed, upon seeing me connected to all those wires and tubes. I recounted everything that had happened with as much coherence as possible, though I still occasionally struggled with words. Bill listened with an increasingly somber expression. When I finished, he remained silent for several minutes, processing the magnitude of the betrayal. "You need immediate legal protection," he finally said, in his practical attorney's tone. "Not only for the criminal case against Mark, but to protect your assets. If he was willing to kill you for your estate, we don't know what else he might try to do legally while out on bail or after the trial." His words chilled me. I hadn't considered that Mark could continue attacking me from other fronts. Bill pulled out his phone and made a call. "Nora, it's Bill Pearson. I need you to come urgently to Metropolitan Medical Center. It's a legal emergency involving a close friend. Yes, today, if possible." He hung up and explained to me, "Nora Grant Adams is one of the best family law and estate planning attorneys in the state. We worked together on several cases when I was still practicing. If anyone can protect you legally, it's her. Nora arrived 3 hours later, a 51-year-old woman with an imposing professional presence. She carried a black leather briefcase and a digital recorder. After formal introductions, she listened to my testimony, recording everything with my explicit consent. Occasionally, she interrupted to clarify specific details or dates. Her face remained professionally neutral, but I detected flashes of indignation in her eyes when I described Mark's exact words. "Mr. Reed, I understand you are going through severe trauma, both physical and emotional," she began, after hearing everything. "But I need you to understand something crucial. The criminal process against your son will proceed regardless of your wishes. The prosecution already has strong evidence. However, what we can control is the protection of your assets and your future testamentary decisions." I nodded, indicating for her to continue. "I recommend 3 immediate actions. First, urgent modification of your current will to completely exclude Mark Alton Davis from any inheritance. Second, establishment of a durable power of attorney, naming trusted individuals to make decisions on your behalf if your cognitive abilities deteriorate further. Third, a legal restraining order against your son once he is prosecuted, prohibiting any contact with you." "Do everything," I replied without hesitation. "Everything necessary to protect me from him." Nora nodded and began taking detailed notes. "For the testamentary modification, I need to know your current intentions. Do you have other heirs in mind? Extended family? Charitable institutions?" The question caught me by surprise. I had spent decades assuming everything would go to Mark, now that future had evaporated. "Charitable institutions," I decided after thinking. "Medical research. Help for sick people without resources. Programs for abandoned elderly." Bill gently squeezed my hand. "That's a noble decision, Victor." Nora continued taking notes. "I will draft the will clearly specifying the reasons for your son's disinheritance. American law allows disinheritance of descendants for severe mistreatment. An attempted homicide certainly qualifies." We remained discussing legal details for another hour. My concentration periodically faltered due to the neurological sequelae, but Bill helped keep me focused. Nora explained that the judicial process against Mark would probably take between 12 and 18 months, but the evidence was so solid that a conviction seemed inevitable. We talked about between 8 and 15 years in prison for aggravated attempted homicide, considering the evident premeditation and the family relationship, to 15 years. My son would spend the best decade of his life in prison. I tried to feel something about it, some paternal sadness, some impulse of mercy. I felt nothing, except a deep emptiness where love had once existed. On the 3rd day of hospitalization, Detective Scott returned to inform me about the progress of the case. Mark had been formally charged, and a preliminary detention hearing would be held in 48 hours. The prosecution will request detention without bail, arguing flight risk and extreme dangerousness, she explained while reviewing documents in her folder. With the recordings and the medical testimony about the sequelae you suffer, it is highly probable that the judge will agree. She also told me that during the initial interrogation, Mark had changed his defensive strategy multiple times. First, he insisted that everything was a misunderstanding, Then he alleged temporary psychological problems. Finally, his defense attorney tried to argue that the words captured in the audio were ambiguous. None of the versions withstand analysis, the detective added with professional satisfaction. The video shows clear premeditation. He brought a spare tube. That requires planning. That revelation impacted me again. Mark had not acted impulsively in a moment of temporary madness. He had planned this with enough anticipation to obtain a fake oxygen tube, to prepare his alibi, to choose the exact moment when medical staff would be least present. The calculating coldness of it all was worse than spontaneous violence. On the fourth day, Nora brought the testamentary documents for my signature. Bill and Angela acted as witnesses, fulfilling all legal requirements for notarization. I read each clause carefully, though it took me twice the normal time due to my slowed cognitive processing. The document explicitly stated, I completely disinherit my son Mark Alton Davis for severe mistreatment consisting of attempted homicide against my person, an act that occurred on August the 23rd, 2024, and duly documented in a criminal case. I signed with a trembling hand, not from doubt, but from persistent physical weakness. Every stroke of my name on that paper represented the definitive end of the father-son relationship. Bill signed as a witness and squeezed my shoulder with silent strength. You've done the right thing, Victor. Protecting yourself is your right and your duty to yourself. His words comforted me more than I had anticipated. Nora placed the documents in her briefcase. This will be registered with the state's last will and testament registry tomorrow. Mark will not be able to successfully challenge it. The evidence of his act is incontrovertible in any court. Then she added something I didn't expect. I have also prepared a civil restraining order separate from the criminal process. Once it is signed by the judge, Mark will be prohibited from approaching within 500 feet of you, your home, or any place you habitually frequent. The idea of needing legal protection against my own son felt surreal, but reality had become surreal since that early morning. I approved everything Nora proposed. She left, promising to keep me informed of every legal development. Bill stayed with me the rest of the afternoon, reading newspaper articles, talking about his grandchildren, offering me the mundane normality that my life had abruptly lost. On the fifth day, cognitive rehabilitation sessions began with neurophysicist Brenda Myers Sanchez. She was a young professional in her early 30s with infinite patience for my frustrations when I couldn't complete simple memory or sequencing exercises. The brain is plastic, Mr. Reed, she constantly repeated. With constant work, many functions can recover significantly. The exercises were mentally exhausting. Remembering sequences of numbers, identifying patterns, reconstructing short stories I had just heard. I failed frequently, and each failure reminded me of the damage Mark had caused. He had not only tried to steal my life, but he had partially stolen my mind, my ability to think clearly, to express myself fluently. That loss angered me more than the attempted murder itself. During one particularly difficult session, I broke down crying unexpectedly. Tears welled up without warning, accompanied by sobs I couldn't control. Brenda immediately stopped the exercises and simply sat by my side in understanding silence. When I finally calmed down, I whispered, "He took away part of who I am. He didn't just try to kill me, he permanently damaged me. She nodded gravely. I know, Victor, and it's okay to be furious about that. Grief for lost abilities is as valid as any other grief. That night, alone in the hospital room, I made a final decision. Mark would cease to exist for me emotionally. On the 6th day, I received news of the court hearing. Mark would remain in pre-trial detention until the trial without possibility of bail. The judge had deemed the risk of recidivism too high, given the nature of the crime and the family relationship that facilitated access to the victim. Detective Scott informed me personally, adding that the defense attorney had tried to argue that I was exaggerating the sequelae, but Dr. Reynolds's neurological reports had been conclusive. That same afternoon, I made an additional decision that had been maturing for days. I called Nora and asked her to come to the hospital urgently. When she arrived, I explained my intention. I want to change the locks on my house immediately. Mark has keys. I also want to check if he has access to my bank accounts or any other assets. I need to completely sever any material ties with him. Nora nodded approvingly. Very prudent. I will also draft a formal revocation of any power or previous authorization you may have granted to your son. I will personally notify your bank, insurance companies, and any other relevant institutions. Bill, present during the conversation, volunteered to supervise the changing of the locks and conduct a complete inspection of my home. We'll look for anything Mark might have left, documents he might have copied, evidence that he had been planning this for longer, Bill suggested, with his methodical attorney's mindset. The idea that my son had been in my house looking for information about my finances, planning to rob me, or worse, turned my stomach. My home, my refuge, had been desecrated long before that early morning in the hospital. On the 7th day, Bill returned with a complete report. He had found several photocopied personal documents in my home or office, property deeds, insurance policies, old bank statements that I kept archived. Mark was meticulously investigating your estate, Bill explained with a grave expression. I also found this. He showed me a photograph on his mobile phone. Handwritten notes in my handwriting, but which I did not remember writing, describing supposed memory, problems, and confusion. I think he was preparing the ground to declare you mentally incapacitated, Bill continued. If you had died in the hospital, perfect for him. If you survived, but with severe brain damage, he would have these forgeries to argue that you were already deteriorated before the incident. He could have tried to get you legally incapacitated and control all your assets as a guardian. The sophistication of the plan left me speechless for several minutes. Nora, who had come with Bill, took photographs of everything. This constitutes additional evidence of premeditation and extensive planning. I will deliver it to the prosecution immediately. It will considerably strengthen the criminal case. I felt strangely validated. Every new revelation confirmed that my decision to completely cut ties with Mark was not only justified, but absolutely necessary for my survival. During my 8th day in the hospital, Dr. Reynolds authorized my medical discharge under strict conditions: continue nocturnal home oxygen therapy, attend cognitive rehabilitation 3 times a week, and monthly neurological follow-up for at least a year. The sequelae will remain, Victor, he warned me honestly. Some symptoms will improve with therapy, others will stabilize, some may persist indefinitely. You will have to adapt to a new normal. Before leaving the hospital, I asked to speak with Angela Vance Parker. The nurse who had saved my life was working the evening shift that day. When she arrived at my room, I asked her to sit down. I had prepared an envelope that I handed to her with trembling hands. "Angela, you saved me. You not only saved me physically that morning, but with your quick intervention, you prevented the brain damage from being much worse. I want to thank you in the only material way I can." Angela opened the envelope and found a check for $10,000. Her face showed absolute shock. "Mr. Reed, I can't accept this. I was just doing my job." I shook my head firmly. "You did much more than your job. You acted when most would hesitate. You saw something irregular and trusted your instinct. You testified against my son, knowing the complications that could bring you. This money does not pay your true worth, but it is my way of expressing genuine gratitude." Angela began to cry silently. "I have huge student loans. This money will change my life." I hugged her awkwardly, my movements still somewhat uncoordinated from the sequelae. "You changed mine. You gave me an opportunity for justice and closure." We stayed like that for several minutes, two strangers united by a terrible morning that paradoxically had revealed the best and the worst of humanity. Returning to my house was a bittersweet experience. Bill accompanied me, carrying my bag and the portable oxygen equipment. The new locks gleamed on the front door, a physical reminder that I now needed to protect myself in my own home. Upon crossing the threshold, everything looked the same, but it felt radically different. Every room held memories of Mark, as a child, a teenager, an adult, photographs on the walls that now made me sick to my stomach. "You can stay with me for a few days if you prefer not to be alone," Bill offered, as he neatly placed my medications in the kitchen. I considered the proposal seriously, but finally declined. I need to face this. I need to reclaim my space, make it feel mine again, and not contaminated by his betrayal. Bill understood and respected my decision, but made me promise to call him immediately if I had any problems or emergencies. The first few days at home were a constant challenge. Simple tasks like making coffee or remembering where I kept certain objects required conscious effort due to memory lapses. I occasionally searched for specific words during phone conversations and had to describe concepts indirectly when the exact term escaped my mind. The frustration was enormous, but Brenda, my neuropsychologist, reminded me during our continuous sessions that every small improvement was a significant victory. One early September afternoon, approximately 2 weeks after hospital discharge, the doorbell rang. It was a messenger with a certified letter. I immediately recognized the sender. Riverside Correctional Facility, Wing C, where Mark was incarcerated. My first impulse was to tear the envelope without opening it, but curiosity won. Inside was a 3-page handwritten letter in my son's handwriting. It began with elaborate apologies. Mark explained that he had been under tremendous financial pressure, that he had accumulated $60,000 in gambling debts with dangerous loan sharks, and that he was desperate. He alleged that he had never really wanted to kill me, only to scare me enough to hand over money immediately. He wrote of his plan as a momentary stupidity driven by panic, and begged for my forgiveness, my legal help, my intervention to reduce the charges. I read the letter 3 times, hoping to feel something, some pang of paternal compassion. Nothing emerged, except disgust. The letter was manipulative from beginning to end. There was no real acknowledgement of the harm caused, only excuses and self-justification. Mark still saw me as a resource to exploit, not as a person he had almost murdered. Even from prison, he was still trying to manipulate me for his purposes. I took the letter, put it back in its envelope, and placed it in a drawer along with all the legal documents related to the case. I would not respond. I would not give him the satisfaction of knowing I had read his lies. Bill, whom I told about the letter that same day, approved my decision. Any response, even negative, would indicate that he still has some kind of emotional power over you. Absolute silence is the best strategy. In October, Nora informed me that the prosecution had formalized the full indictment. The trial was tentatively scheduled for April 2025. Mark faced charges of aggravated attempted homicide due to kinship and premeditation, with a prosecutorial request of 13 years in prison. His defense attorney had tried to negotiate a reduction of charges to severe assault, but the prosecution flatly rejected any negotiation given the irrefutable audio-visual evidence. "You will have to testify during the trial," Nora warned me. "The defense will try to argue that your cognitive sequelae affect the reliability of your testimony, but we have the videos, we have Angela's testimony, we have the medical reports. Your testimony will be supplementary, not fundamental." The idea of facing Mark in a courtroom both terrified and empowered me simultaneously. It would be my opportunity to look him in the eyes and publicly declare how he had destroyed any bond between us. During that period, I established a new daily routine: waking up early, cognitive exercises for an hour, physical therapy 3 times a week to improve affected motor coordination, short walks around the neighborhood, slow reading of books that I used to devour quickly. Bill visited me 2 or 3 times a week, sharing meals and conversation without pressure. Angela sent me a message thanking me again for the check and telling me she had paid off half of her student debts. But the nights were difficult. Alone, connected to my nocturnal oxygen machine, my mind incessantly replayed that early morning. I saw Mark's hands disconnecting the tube. I heard his cold words about my death and his inheritance. I woke up with a racing heart, compulsively checking that the oxygen was working correctly, terrified of falling completely asleep. November brought unexpected news. Sophia requested a meeting with me through Nora, who consulted me on whether I wished to accept the encounter. I hesitated considerably, but finally agreed under strict conditions, in a neutral location, with Nora present as a witness and with a maximum duration of 30 minutes. We agreed to meet at a Central Hotel Cafe on November 12th at 4 p.m. Sophia arrived punctually, visibly aged since our last encounter at the hospital. Deep, dark circles under her eyes and disheveled hair revealed the weight she carried. She sat across from me without her usual dominant air. "Victor, thank you for agreeing to see me," she began with a broken voice. I remained silent, waiting for her to get to the point. Nora discreetly took notes beside me. "I have visited Mark in prison weekly," Sophia continued after taking a deep breath. "At first, I only listened to his complaints, his excuses, his plans to appeal. But 2 weeks ago, something happened. One of the prison psychologists asked to speak with me. He showed me psychological evaluations of Mark that reveal things I preferred to ignore for years." Her hands trembled around her coffee cup. The psychologist explained that Mark exhibits severe narcissistic traits and a significant absence of real empathy. He made me see patterns that I had always justified as ambition or healthy confidence: systematic lies since adolescence, manipulation of close people, inability to genuinely take responsibility for his mistakes. Sophia paused, wiping away tears that began to fall. Basically, they told me that we raised someone with sociopathic traits and I constantly enabled him. I listened without interrupting, without offering comfort. This revelation came too late and had cost too much, Sophia continued. I don't expect your forgiveness, Victor. I came to tell you that I finally understand what you tried to do for years. Set boundaries, demand consequences, teach him responsibility. I always prevented you, always protected him from everything, and turned him into someone capable of trying to kill his own father for money. What do you expect me to do with this information, Sophia? I finally asked, my voice coming out colder than anticipated. She shook her head. Nothing. I just needed you to know that I will no longer defend the indefensible. I have hired a separate attorney for myself because the prosecution is investigating whether I had prior knowledge of his plans. I did not, but I need to protect myself legally, and I want you to know that I will not interfere with the trial or try to manipulate you into withdrawing your testimony. We remained in silence for several minutes. Nora discreetly checked her watch. Finally, Sophia added one last thing. I also want to apologize for the harm my parental negligence indirectly caused you. I know it sounds empty after everything, but it's sincere. She stood to leave, but before she went, she asked, Are the neurological sequelae permanent? Some are, I replied simply. Occasional memory problems, difficulty finding specific words sometimes, fine motor coordination affected. I can function, but I am not who I was before that morning. Sophia nodded slowly, as if finally comprehending the full magnitude of the damage. She left without another word. Nora and I remained seated for 10 additional minutes, processing the conversation. She was genuine, Nora finally commented. I've seen many performances in my career. That woman is truly broken by understanding her role in creating the monster her son became. I nodded, but felt no particular satisfaction from Sophia's suffering. I simply felt the accumulated weight of decades of wrong decisions by multiple people converging on that August morning. December brought more legal developments. Mark's defense attorney tried a desperate strategy. He requested a complete psychiatric evaluation, alleging possible mental illness that diminished his criminal responsibility. The judge approved the evaluation, but the results were devastating for the defense. Forensic psychiatrists concluded that Mark was fully aware of his actions, perfectly understood the difference between right and wrong, and had acted with full capacity to control his behavior. The report mentions problematic personality traits, but explicitly rejects any diagnosis that could legally exonerate him. Nora explained to me when we reviewed the documents. In fact, the evaluation strengthens the argument of premeditation because it demonstrates that he meticulously planned, knowing exactly what he was doing. The defensive strategy had completely backfired. January 2025, 5 months after the incident, I received final discharge from intensive neurological follow-up. Dr. Reynolds conducted a comprehensive final evaluation. You have recovered approximately 70% of the affected cognitive function, he informed me, reviewing the results of neuropsychological tests. The remaining 30% probably represents the permanent damage we initially discussed. You have learned effective compensatory strategies. He handed me a detailed medical report for the trial that meticulously documented the permanent sequelae directly caused by oxygen deprivation. The trial began on April 14, 2025, at the county courthouse. I arrived early, accompanied by Bill and Nora. The corridors of the courthouse buzzed with lawyers, witnesses, and journalists. The case had attracted considerable media attention. Son attempts to murder father for inheritance, caught on video with audio. It was the kind of story that morbidly fascinated the public. I entered the courtroom and saw Mark for the first time since that early morning. He was sitting next to his defense attorney, dressed in a dark suit, trying to project respectability. Our eyes met briefly. I saw no remorse in his eyes, only contained resentment. I deliberately looked away, denying him even that small recognition. The first day was dedicated to formal presentations and the reading of charges. The prosecutor, a 47-year-old woman named Ellen Riley Vance, methodically outlined the sequence of events with surgical precision. She described the hospitalization, the opportunity Mark identified, the evident premeditation in bringing prepared equipment, the act itself, and the permanent neurological consequences for the victim. She spoke for 45 minutes, building an irrefutable narrative. The defense attorney tried to sow doubt, arguing ambiguity in the words captured by audio, suggesting that Mark might have been talking to himself, expressing irrational fears about losing the inheritance, not actual plans. The argument sounded ridiculous even as he presented it. The video showed clear actions, not abstract thoughts. It showed hands disconnecting tubes, deliberately replacing them, watching the victim slowly die. I testified on the second day. The prosecutor guided me through my testimony carefully. I described waking up, observing Mark, hearing his exact words, feeling the oxygen being withdrawn. Angela's intervention. I occasionally paused, searching for specific words, evidencing the sequelae that Dr. Reynolds had documented. The prosecutor used these moments strategically to demonstrate the tangible harm caused to the court. During cross-examination, the defense attorney tried to confuse me with questions about specific temporal details. Are you sure it was exactly 3 a.m.? It could have been 3:15. I calmly replied that the exact time was irrelevant. What was relevant was what I witnessed and experienced. The judge intervened several times, limiting repetitive questions that tried to exploit my cognitive difficulties. Angela testified on the third day. Her account was devastating for the defense. She described finding Mark by my bed, with the tube disconnected, my oxygen saturation dangerously low, the original tube on the floor. She explained that her medical training allowed her to immediately recognize that the situation was not accidental. An oxygen tube does not disconnect itself and end up hidden under a chair, she declared firmly. And a worried family member calls the nurses immediately if they notice something irregular. They don't try to fix it personally in the dark. On the fourth day, the security video was projected on a large screen. Seeing those images in a crowded courtroom was surreal. I watched judges, jurors, and spectators watching my son methodically disconnect my oxygen. I heard his words amplified by loudspeakers. This way, you won't take long to die. I need your house now. The subsequent silence was absolute. Even the defense attorney seemed defeated. Mark finally testified on the fifth day. His attorney had clearly advised him to admit the act but claimed temporary emotional disturbance. Mark tried to cry as he described unbearable financial pressures, loan sharks threatening him, desperation clouding his judgment, but his tears seemed rehearsed, mechanical. The prosecutor tore him apart during cross-examination, exposing contradictions in his account and highlighting the calculated coldness required to plan everything in advance. The jury's deliberations lasted barely 6 hours. On April 22nd, we returned for the verdict. guilty of aggravated attempted homicide due to kinship and premeditation. The sentence came immediately: 12 years and 6 months in prison, ineligibility to exercise parental rights or guardianship, a permanent restraining order against me for life. Mark remained motionless as the sentence was read, his face a mask of disbelief. I left the courthouse feeling strangely empty. I had expected satisfaction, closure, something, but I only felt profound exhaustion. Bill hugged me in silence. Nora confirmed that the modified will and disinheritance were now absolutely legally airtight. Angela, who had attended the trial on days her schedule allowed, briefly took my hand. "Justice," she whispered simply. The following months, I dedicated to rebuilding a life that Mark had fragmented. I continued therapies, accepted the permanent limitations, found new ways to fill my days. I got involved with an association for victims of domestic violence, sharing my experience to help others facing similar situations. I discovered purpose in transforming my trauma into a tool of support for others. Today, as I write this, 14 months have passed since that early morning. The sequelae remain. Some words still occasionally escape me. My motor coordination will never be perfect, but I have learned to live with dignity within these limitations. I have learned that true family is not defined by blood, but by genuine loyalty. Bill, Nora, Angela, Brenda, they are my real family now. Mark is serving his sentence in prison. I have not responded to any of his subsequent letters. For me, he ceased to exist that morning when he chose my death over my life, and I have found peace in that absence. If you liked this story, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box on the left. Thanks for watching.